Well, my name is Vance Rasmussen. I was born on October 31st, Halloween, by the way, of 1942. And I was born in Dixon, Illinois, and who was famous for, I think it was Ronald Reagan. One of them, I don't know who, but I think it was Ronald Reagan. But I haven't really been back there. And grew up in Iowa. And had started coming out to Colorado when I was in, gosh, probably around 1948, 49. And I loved Boulder. I decided someday I was going to live there. And eventually I did. I moved out here in 1965. And it was after a divorce, but in the meantime then, my name went to the head of the list for the service. And they had papers to me within 3 weeks of the divorce. And at that time, it was they were making the big push for Vietnam. They were building up the troops because our military had gone down in numbers. So now they're really going after it and building them up. And so I decided I'd enlist. And I knew that would keep me out of going to Vietnam. So I enlisted, and I passed all their tests. And it's an interesting sidebar there, but I passed all the tests, did quite well. And I was going to be accepted in the National Security Agency. But I had to sign a 4-year enlistment, which I said, I don't have a problem with that. You know, I can live with that. Well, they did a background check on me. As it happens, on the night of my 18th birthday, when I turned 18 at midnight, a bunch of us from high school got together and we decided to paint a school. Well, we decided to get away from the police, and we did. Well, then we had to come out of this development while the police were there waiting. Nobody would admit to anything. We put down to the city hall, and they finally arraigned us, or booked us, at 2 o'clock in the morning, which means I had turned 18 and become an adult. So this little thing that we did was now a felony. So that's ended up keeping me out of the NSA. I said, well, I'm not going to sign up for 4 years then. And they said, well, and I said, no. I said, you know, I'll go the 3 years, and then my choice would be send me to medical school. And they did a great job of that. They sent me to a helicopter parts school in Fort Eustis, Virginia, which I thought was real close to the medical field. And so I got down there, and I forget how many weeks we had. I think it was probably over 2 months, 2.5 months maybe. And so I got out of that school in January, the end of January of 1966. And immediately, we were put, the next day, I remember the school, we got our graduation on a Wednesday. And on Thursday, I was on a plane headed for Oakland on my way to Vietnam. There was no leave, no nothing. That's where we went. They just shipped us right on out. And we went directly to Oakland. We were in the big Oakland Army Terminal. Cots were 3 bunks high. And there was probably, I'm guessing, there was at least 1,500 guys in this one barracks, or this warehouse that I was in. Well, what else do? You play poker. So I made approximately $1,500 that day. And I decided, well, I don't know what I can do. I can't take, what am I going to do with this in Vietnam? So I decided the wiser thing to do was to go over the fence and go down into Jack London Square and spend some money. I somehow squandered half of it that night. And it was, won't say what all it was on, but I squandered it. And anyway, got a cab back, and I walked right through the gate and walked back in. Nobody was ever the wiser. We were spending another three days, I guess, and then we were headed out by airplane. In the meantime, while we're there, they put you through and they give you your shots, and they go through and they tell you, now don't move, because they got this big gun that shoots like 12 shots into you at one time. And they said, if you move, you're going to rip your shoulder off. And they got everybody scared. Well, as it happened, you know, I'm probably the oldest one in this whole group. And I was, well, I would have been, I had turned 23 that October. I went in on September 13th, and but now we were on our way, so we were flying over there to Vietnam. I went in as a replacement, so consequently I didn't train with all the people that had gone over there. The thing was, when they went over, they left on the 1st of October, and they left by ship. So it took them a month to get there. Well, so they got there November 1st. Well, their tour actually started when they left on the 1st of October. So they were rotating out in September. So they only actually served in country 11 months. Whereas those of us that were flown over as replacements, we were there over the 12 months. But they counted that as being part of it, that trip over. I guess being locked in a ship for 30 days is bad enough. You deserve it. And we went to, flew into Tan Son Nhut, and they took us in big 2.5-ton trucks to, 2.5-ton trucks and buses to Ben Hoa, which is just outside of Saigon. And we were there, and then I was supposed to deploy to the 128th Aviation Group right outside of, well, in Ben Hoa. Well, this was right after the Battle of the Ai Drang Valley, which was in the early part of December. And they'd lost a lot of people, and there was a big buildup for the Cav Division, because they had gone over by boat. They left October 1st, and they got there on November 1st. But they had, they built the camp and everything. Well, they needed replacements up there, so they switched my orders, and they sent me to the 1st Cav Division. I was in the, that's an interesting, because when we went, they put us in a C-130, which is a big cargo plane, but they just got a lot of seats in it. You know, these nylon bench seats that you suffer in. And so we're all set, and we're headed up there, and I'm flying up and coming in for landing, and we're coming into this valley, and you don't see much of anything because there's no real windows in this aircraft. Well, all of a sudden we hit the ground, and it sounded like a machine gun going off. Well, they built the runway out of what they call PSP, which is a metal, long strips of metal with holes in them that they could lay down on this loose dirt and everything, and they interlocked them and everything. That was your runway. But it sounded, when those tires hit it, it sounded just like a machine gun going off. And, okay, we're getting out, got out, I'm getting ready to get out and go down, got my stuff, and off to the side I look at this patrol coming in, and half of them are bandaged up and everything else. And I thought, oh, what am I doing here? That was all I could think of. Well, didn't change anything. The 1st Cav was stationed in An Khê, which is basically it's up in the Central Highlands, midway up in Vietnam, high up in the mountains. And it was situated, Quy Nhon was on the coast. That was one of the major ports that they would go in, and it wasn't a deep sea port. They would have to take and offload on what they call barks. It was a bark unit, but a barge. And then they would put the barges on shore and unload there. And it was halfway between Quy Nhon, and the other main one was Pleiku. And I think I'm not positive, I think the 1st Infantry Division was up in Pleiku. And An Khê was right in the middle of that. Pleiku was still up in the mountains, but it sat on a plain. And whereas Quy Nhon was on the coast. And there was a road went between the two towns. It went from Quy Nhon to An Khê and on up to Pleiku. And there was a lot of activity outside of Pleiku from the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. And then the major deep ports you had was Saigon was, I think, a deep water port, and Cam Bay, which was up in Nha Trang. And Nha Trang was the old provincial French capital there. And that was I'd flown into Nha Trang before several times. And Nha Trang was a beautiful, beautiful city, but it had that French influence to it, of the structures and everything else. So they sent me to the 15th TC Battalion, which was a transportation corps, and that was based right on the flight line. And they serviced still some Chinooks and mostly B model and D model, which are the gunship and troop carriers. Well, I worked in their tech supply for a while, and we had what they called an NCOIC, which was your non-commissioned officer in charge. And this guy, turns out he was an alcoholic, but we didn't get along, so they shipped me up to the flight line. And I ran what they called the shop supply. So I was on the flight line the whole, up there. And that shop supply would carry nuts, bolts, wire, fuel filters, the little piddly stuff that screws, stuff like that you needed. Well, I had a knack for being able to acquire stuff. And that came to light because I would circumvent most of their processes. And I had a system whereby I have a very good memory for numbers. And I could still recite a lot of them, the federal stock numbers on a UH-1B and D model helicopter. They're stuck in my head after all 50-some years. And I would go down to they gave me a Jeep to drive and everything else, and I would go down to where everything came in. And if I saw something that I knew we needed, I would just go over it and I'd spray paint it over with white paint or black paint, and then I'd slap a stencil on it and put our number on it for our unit and stencil our number on it, and then somebody else would deliver it to us in a day or so. Well, at that time, other than my nuts, bolts, and wire, at one time I had 80 sets of main rotor blades. I had swash plates, hubs. I had tail rotors. I had everything imaginable. And it was far more than even the tech supply had. And so I got a lot of liberties with that because my CO was a major, and he would fly me anywhere I wanted to go, and within a half hour's notice. And we would fly into a lot of the LZs and everything else to, we'd have to send somebody out they'd have to be there when they were working the LZs, the landing zones, to give them fuel filters and that, because in Vietnam you had a lot of the sand and the dust, and that just did a horrendous number on the filters in these aircraft. But I was one time caught up in Pleiku in a warehouse, and some captain or major caught me, and he says, "Now what are you doing in here?" And I said, "Well, I just looking for some parts and that." And he says, "No, you don't have any paperwork." And I said, "Oh, well," he says, "Who are you? Who's with you?" And I said, "Well, my the officer out there in the aircraft that's flying." And he went out. Well, he started to go after this lieutenant colonel, and this colonel just dressed him down. In the meantime, I'm loading everything in on the other side of the aircraft. And then away we went. And there was numerous instances of that. Another one was, later on, was we were short of food. That's the one thing. If the Navy didn't have it, and the Air Force didn't have it on the first line, then whoever was on the shores where they unloaded got most of it. And with the unit I was in, the type that we had, we weren't authorized C rations. So we had to acquire what we could. Well, the one thing they always had was flour, butter, and sugar. So we ate a lot of bread with butter on it and sugar, just for something to eat. So one time I decided, well, they had a ration breakdown in Quinnan where they dispersed everything. And so I went down there. I had a deuce and a half, and they followed me down with a gunship. And we had like 4 or 5 of us that went. we got down there, and I started through, and it was about, I can't think how many hours drive. It was maybe 2.5, 3 hour drive down through the mountains. And it was pretty rough roads. Anyway, we got down, and we're pulling in, and I positioned it so that we had a Jeep behind us as you were driving through this ration breakdown. I just loaded up what I needed, pulled up to the front, and they said, well, we need to see your paperwork to get this checked out. And I said, okay. I said, but they've got it, and my officer in charge has got it in the vehicle behind me. So, okay. I said, all right. So I took off. And they got that poor guy behind me and started in on him. Well, we managed to make it out of town. And that gunship met us. And away we went back up into the mountains.
You talked about the conditions in Vietnam, played havoc with the filters and things on the helicopters. What other kind of maintenance issues did you have? And was it mostly mechanical, or were you having to repair battle damage as well?
Yeah, there was a lot of battle damage. I've got pictures at home, and we had what we called flying cranes. And I think there were only 2 in the Army at that time. And these things could lift a tank, basically. And they'd have to fly in with these flying cranes. If an aircraft was shot, or a ship was shot down, they would have to go in. The Army had this ridiculous thing where they wanted the data plate out of the helicopter. So you'd have to send some GIs out there to get the data plate, and they'd fly them in there. Well, then they'd try to lift these out of there, and then there was a lot of salvage that went on, a lot of salvage, because with the number of helicopters that were being built and the damage that was being done to them, there just weren't enough parts being produced. So there was a lot of salvage work went on. And you just, you'd get, I know I've heard of one story from a fellow that actually lives here in Broomfield, and I think he was shot down 14 times in a helicopter. But he was telling me, he said, well, you know, he said, we took a bullet through one of the blades on the helicopter, and there's just, you know, the 2 blades going around, and anybody knows that they have to be balanced. Well, with that hole in there, they're not balanced. So he said, you know what we did? And I said, no, I can't figure out what you did. He said, I went around the other side and put a hole through the other one at the same spot on the other blade, and it balanced it. And he said, we got it out of there. But, I mean, that's the type of things they did to get things done. It was forever, you know, I mean, it was, the maintenance, as we say, is just constant there, especially along the beaches. The sand really does, and the sand and the dust, because a lot of the areas where we were, especially in the dry season, the dust was incredible that would come up into these aircraft. And then if you were along the coast, the sand would kick it up and just tear the living daylights out of them too. You had maintenance was ongoing, and they wanted turnaround on them. You needed to get them out as fast as you could. So, like I said, a lot of it was just salvage. There was ships all over there that were just blown to pieces, but there was something salvageable on it that could be used. It was your own private junkyard, so to speak. But when it came to fixing the aircraft, if it was a really fixable aircraft, a lot of times, if it just was filters and that, you'd go out in the field, and we'd have one of us would go out and we'd work an LZ and take some parts with us, and then the mechanics would come and get what they needed from us. But it was just a matter of if you couldn't fix it right there, they would send in that flying crane, and they just lower straps down, hook it up, and lift it right out of there and bring it back to the base to be put down. And then they, like I said, they either salvaged stuff off of it or they fixed them. There's, again, it was constant repairs on them. Interestingly, we went through this well, you'd start up the mountains and you'd go through this, over this pass, or through this pass. And it was, because if you were flying, they could just sit on each side of the mountaintops and shoot across at you. Well, eventually they put what they called rock forces up there, Republic of Korea. And this was the White Horse Division. And they were some of the toughest people I ever seen. Really, really tough fighters. And they had no mercy, none whatsoever. So they placed them on each side, on the tops of these mountains there, and that cleared the pass so that we could get an aircraft through there. And you couldn't go up any higher because a helicopter only flies so high. They go a lot higher now, but they didn't then.
Were you a mark with that repair going on, and did they know that you were repairing all these?
Oh yeah, yeah. And it wasn't, when you were at an LZ landing zone, it was somewhat secure. I mean, any LZ, nothing is totally secure. But there was a lot of troops around and everything else. And these pilots that we had in that era were fearless. And I mean fearless. I mean, some of the stories that I've read since then, and some of the stories I'd heard then of what these pilots would do, because, I mean, they were just sitting ducks in these aircraft. And they weren't really armor plated or anything. So, and this, like I said, the metal on these things is just thin aluminum. So a bullet could go through those and nothing flat. And if they had a machine gun or something like that on one of those, it took nothing you could bring a helicopter down. Although a lot of people don't realize you can land one with the engine out. A lot of people don't realize that. It has to be in a freewheeling auto rotation, and usually you don't want to get hit in the oil cooler or something like that, because then you are going down. But when they say auto rotation, it means it's just like putting your car in neutral and coasting. But then the power of it going down would turn the blades enough that it was a pretty rough landing. But you could get one down. I mean, they weren't all the greatest landings, and some of them, they didn't work either. I ran into a man here in Broomfield. I was at a car show over at Silterhar Ford one day, and I had my first Cav hat on. And he came in and he says, "I was in the Cav in Korea." And I said, "Oh, really?" And I said, he said, "I was in a helicopter unit there." And I said, "You were?" And I said, "I was too, in Vietnam." I said, "I actually flew with a Korean veteran." And he was quite a bit older, and we called him Pappy Wyndham. He says, "Oh, Jim Wyndham, he was a friend of mine." And I'm dumbfounded by this. Well, then he just kept talking and talking. His son finally had to come and get him. And I've since seen him at the museum. But it was, the helicopter people at that time were a very small number. And of course it grew as the war went on, but in the beginning there were not a lot of people in it. So you kind of got to know everybody that was around. Not on a real personal basis, but you know, the names were there, and you recognize them. But these pilots were definitely marks. I mean, as I said before, they were absolutely fearless. Some of them were just incredible pilots too. And some of the things they would do to fly those things is, most people wouldn't even think of doing it if they were acrobatic pilots, or something. They wouldn't even try it. But that's what they did.
I was in the Army peacetime.
Mm-hmm.
And it was 1958. They recreated the invasion of the Philippines, Operation Strongback. And that's the first I went in with Armed Forces Radio to go up to northern Luzon, where we had this big thing going. And they referred to it as vertical envelopment. They were bringing helicopters in 58 in the Army.
Well, they were using helicopters in Korea. They would fly, I think they were called, I won't say what they were observation helicopters basically, but they would have stretchers on each side, outside. And so they didn't carry a lot of troops or anything. And all this came later on as the industry developed, and you saw some of that in 58. But then course, again, the big push came in, well, in 65, you know, when 64 and 64 and 65 is when they built up the 1st Cav Division Air Mobile, which was in Fort Benning, Georgia, if I'm not mistaken, yeah. And a lot of the part schools or the mechanic schools were in Fort Rucker, Alabama, a lot of those. Again, I was in Fort Eustis, Virginia for the parts school. But they had that buildup, and it was a whole new type of warfare that they were using. And that's when they had the gunships and the troop ships. Troops ship would carry, it was a D model, and it would carry probably about 9 people. And of course, your gunship was just what that was. And you might be able to load on a couple, 3 people into it to fly them out if they were wounded or something. But that was, and then while I was just at the end of when I was there in 67, I think that probably, I don't recall if it was late 66 they had any of them. I know in 67 they were just now getting some of the new, what they called the Cobra in. And I think I saw one once over there. I think, I can't remember that far, but I think I saw one at one point. Well, then it progressed from there, and they've come on with a whole bunch of different types of helicopters.
Well, the helicopter was so important, especially in some place like Vietnam. It was the only way you could get
It's the only way you could move people, and it's the only way you could extract them. But, and again, that wasn't always the easiest thing to do, because we were talking before, I mean, these guys, the minute they came in, a lot of times the Viet Cong and that North Vietnamese would sit and wait they'd pin a unit down, purposely pin it down, and for the helicopter to come in so they could shoot a helicopter down. I mean, and because these guys were going to do their best. It was, yeah, I had some others, but I don't know how factual they are, because I know I've read stories of where one guy made 25 trips in a day to remove and extract soldiers that were wounded and everything, and be under fire the whole time. And it was, there's stories like that went on back then. And I've read these in books and that since then.
I'm sure it happened.
Oh yeah, there's no question about it happening. Like I said, I saw some of these pilots. I flew with some of them, and I say it again, they were fearless. They knew they had to do a job, and that those people relied on them, so they were going to get it done one way or another. Helicopters were so new, and going back even to Vietnam, I mean, when I got there, we didn't have a lot of rules. I mean, we kind of made our own rules as we went, and later on, what they had to go through, it was a requirement that they have like a pilot, and you had to have a co-pilot, you had to have a crew chief, you had to have a gunner in these helicopters. Well, in the early times, there weren't enough pilots. So I can remember times that this CO of mine would have me sitting in the co-pilot seat. And I had no clue what I was doing. I couldn't have done anything with that aircraft. But they had to have a body in there. Other times they called me the crew chief. And another time I'd be the gunner. And at that point, when I first started, you weren't strapped in or anything. Later on, they had straps to get people in and hold them there. But up until then, I mean, we were just flying, hanging on. That's all we did. We didn't have anything to fasten to. And it was, riding in a helicopter was a unique experience. You know, and it was exhilarating. It was fun, but at that time there was a lot of danger to it, I think, because they hadn't really, and I said they had no real rules yet. We pretty much did what we wanted when we wanted. It's not like you're in a seat in an airplane where you got an armrest and everything else. Most of this is just web seating in them, and there's no real protection. A lot of guys would just sit on their helmets, you know, That's how they did it, or their flak vest. We did have flak vests, and that's what towards the end, we wore them all the time. But in the early stages, we didn't have any flak vests or anything. You just flew. The exhilaration you get from those is you're right there. I mean, it's not like you're looking out the side of an airplane. You're living it right then and there, and the air's coming in, and of course we flew with the doors open and everything, so it was. And you couldn't. There was no instrument flying, basically. You know, I mean, there wasn't a lot of that. You flew by visual.
They had to have lost troops, didn't they, just not being strapped in?
Oh yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure they did. But later on, they put straps in and they hooks and everything else, you know, and harness. They did all kinds of that stuff, but that wasn't how it started out. It was like your old crop duster pilots flying by the seat of their pants, and that's what a lot of these guys did. A lot of them did it that way. And later on, I'm listening to other people and their stories, and everything was so strict. Later on, they had to, in order for somebody to say bomb something, you had to go back to your headquarters, talk to headquarters. They had to go up to command headquarters, and then a lot of times the command would have to go back to the Pentagon to get authorization to do it. And by the time they did that, you're talking a day later, well, these people are gone. So that's why I was very happy for the period that I was there, because we didn't have those rules. We did what we wanted when we wanted. I'm guessing maybe 6 months after I was there, I got to take an R&R, which is rest and recuperation, and I went to Singapore. And it was actually the first week they opened Singapore up. Actually, I saw a guy get killed in a bar in Singapore when I was there on R&R. Two merchant seamen from, I don't know where they're from, Russia or something, in Germany, I don't know where, but they got into it and they went outside to settle it. And one of the guys just picked up a 2x4 and laid it across the other guy's head, killed him, came back in and started drinking again. I waited for the police to come. Nobody said anything. There was nothing to them. I went in very little money didn't need much to spend. But Singapore was beautiful then. Well, then I came back, and later on then I got another one that was what they called an in-country R&R to Vung Tau. And that's a little place down south of, I believe it's south of Saigon. It's a beach town. And we went down and they flew us in on what they called a caribou, which has a drop back that you get out of. We spent 3 days, 2 nights there, and we started to go back, and I looked over and I saw this caribou over there, and I thought, there was a line of I don't know how many to get on that, and they're waiting for the next one to come in. And I thought, you know, it's blistering hot out there. So I decided, oh, there's got to be another way. Well, there's the building where, the terminal building, was just a shack, so to speak. So I went over there and I asked if they had anything going up to Saigon. And they said, yeah, we do. I said, is there any way I could hop aboard and, you know, just get a ride up to Saigon with you? Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, it's the first time I ever heard of it. It was called Air America, which was the CIA's own little private air force. And so I rode up in style. I rode in that plane all the way back to Saigon. And I managed to forget to go back to my unit. And so my NCO, I see a new one, he came down and hunted for me. Well, he spent another 5 days with me there. And then we went back and flew into Quinnon and then flew back up from there. They sent an aircraft down to get us. In December of that year, I ended up going on another R&R to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. And that was interesting too, because it was the first week it had opened. And I haven't been back to Kuala Lumpur, but it was a beautiful, beautiful city. All of them were. If you were flying, and I did quite a bit of flying, if you were flying, you looked down, it was beautiful country, absolutely beautiful country, except for the crater holes from the B-29s and that. But it was, the bomb holes were there, but other than that, it was really gorgeous, and a lot of jungle.
When you were there in 65 or 66, 67, did you have many dealings with the civilians? Did you get to go into the cities at all, or were you pretty much basebound?
No, we were just, we did not, we had a, they did have one interesting thing, and I think it was in Life magazine, or I think it was Life magazine, when I got back, I found they had this huge spread, and they called it Ankei's Sin City. Well, there was no place, there was no entertainment, so to speak. I mean, there was nothing, and the guys had nothing to do, and we couldn't go into a town and party at a bar or anything like that. So they built this, what I would call a compound. And you went in, it was all fenced in and everything, and razor wired and the whole bit, had guards all around it and everything else. And it was just a big horseshoe of bars. And then in the center was buildings backed up to each other as another square that had more bars in them. And there was rooms in the back of them. Well, it was called Sin City for a reason. And they actually had, there were doctors there that inspected all of these women and treated them. And then the GIs, that's where they went for their entertainment. You go there and drink, and you could eat. You know, you'd eat their home-style food and everything. I think the most unique thing about that one is that I think at night it became a place for the Viet Cong to go. Yeah. And so it was shared women, so to speak, or whatever you want to call it. But yeah, you could, money wasn't really anything. I mean, I shipped everything back to the bank. It went directly to my bank, and I think I kept $25 a month. And that was more than sufficient. I played poker with that, and I won a lot of money over there playing poker. A lot of money. Yeah, but the problem was getting it back. So I'd have to send it back in increments, trying to get it home. You'd have to get somebody to cash it out, because you had they paid you in what they called P's or piastres, and it was script. So, but the Sin City was a whole nother story. And nothing was ever, until I saw this huge article in Life or Look magazine, and I cannot remember which. But I'll never forget that, and I think my mom and dad saw it, and they said, "What's this?" And I said, "Well, nothing really. It's just a place to party, and because there's something to do." Many times, I guess, during that time, I mean, you could say a lot of things happened. I guess I try to remember the funny ones. And we had a lot of instances of that, because we had the bad ones too. We would get mortared, and I remember the tent across from me, there was a new kid came in, and he wanted to go up to what we had, an enlisted men's club, which was just a tent or a shack that we built. And so he went in there, and he had too much to drink and passed out in his bunk. Well, the shells started coming in, and he didn't wake up. And the shell landed right up above him, top of him, and blew him to pieces. We lost him. We lost several others that night, wounded. Quite a few others wounded that night, because they basically hit our company area harder than anything else. We just happened to be the pick for that time. Many aircraft were damaged, and you had what they called, to repair them, you had to have what they called skin, which was aluminum. Well, we didn't have enough of that around. So I got out the old roll of Army duct tape, and they used duct tape on most of the bullet holes and shrapnel holes, because the sappers had gotten inside. The sappers are the people with the satchel bags of explosives. and they'd gotten inside our perimeter. And they destroyed, like I said, they destroyed a lot of aircraft, and they just a lot of damage, let's put it that way. But other times we had, I guess the worst thing we had to contend with was if you had to go into a bunker, we had lots of rats. And I have such a hatred for them now. I mean, they were afraid of nothing, these rats. Yeah, but it was damp and wet in there, and the humidity, and a lot of water in them, because you're in the jungle. It'd go from like 120 degrees during the day to 50 degrees at night. Well, you get in there, and all of a sudden, you'd be inside these bunkers, and all of a sudden the rats are climbing all over you. Well, not people. You can't handle that. Well, then on another time, the kid sleeping on the cot next to me or by me, I always kept a mosquito net over me. He didn't. And he woke up with one of the rats gnawing on his arm, which then means you get rabies shots. We had 2 of them in our tent that both had required rabies shots from getting bitten and chewed on. And the rats were just unbelievably. Another time, it was during the monsoon season, which is a rainy season there. And when the rain comes down, there's a lot of it. I mean, it's continual, day after day after day, for several months. And he had the corner bunk, or corner cot, and the entrance or the bunker was right beside it. So he's there one night, and all of a sudden, this whole thing, the bunker had become saturated. Well, it was way too much water for it, and over it came. It fell over into him, and he thought he was dying. He thought that the place had been blowing up, and he was going to die right then and there, and he was screaming his head off. He was so scared. It was a lot of the funny things like that. You used for roofs. You used the old shot-up helicopter blades, and then piled sandbags on top of them. We eventually built our own, what we called a mess hall. We were able to scrounge concrete and enough wood and everything, and that was probably our first real structure that we had. Otherwise, we were always in tents. Well, that was all good, but then we wanted to avoid having to go outside the perimeter to get any water. It was just a lot safer. Well, so we decided we'd dig a well. Well, they dug and dug and dug, and they got down and they hit what you might call bedrock or something there. And so it needed to blow through it. So we got somebody from the Corps of Engineers to come in, and they were going to put a shape charge in. And they did, and they put the shape charge in, and everybody got the heck out of the way. They set that off, and it blew the whole end off of this whole new mess hall that we built. They shaped it the wrong way. Just blew it to kingdom come. You see stuff like that. It's funnier than all get out now. At that time, it wasn't funny because we had a real structure that we could sit in. It wasn't raining on us or anything else. And then then we built another one that was a really nice one. But to even get wood, we had to scrounge wood. We had to do everything we could to get that stuff. And I think we went through, that year I was there, I think we went through 3 tents with shrapnel holes and everything else. And again, you get rot and everything, but most of that was just shrapnel holes. And we built a floor out of mortar shell boxes, just pushing boxes together. So we had a real floor to walk on. And then I know one night we were mortared, and I was coming back. We had a shower that we also built, and we put a big transmission can up. And then we got the water in it, and we put a drip system in for the avgas, and it just dripped it, and then that's what heated the water. And it would heat your water. But the first guys, I mean, the guys that took one in the middle time frame, they were pretty good shape. The first guys would burn everything on themselves because that water would be so hot. But we're coming back, and I was walking up. It was down, maybe 100 yards away or so. I guess it wasn't even that far. Walking up the dirt, in front to get back to my tent, and the shells started coming in, and I made a run into the tent and grabbed some pants to get going, and I was crawling across that floor trying to pull my pants on. Well, I got a lot of slivers going across it, and that was quite uncomfortable. Most of your clothes were ragged anyway from the jungle, and the humidity would just destroyed clothing. It took, it took me, I don't know how many months. I went over, we had what they called the green uniform, just your standard military green uniform, and starched up and everything else. Well, eventually then, after we were there, they'd come out with these jungle fatigues, which were lighter weight, and they were a heck of a lot more comfortable to work in. And we got those, and we got jungle boots, stuff like that. But it was so early that nothing was available. So you just kept right on going. You plugged away. You did what you had to do with what you had, and it just went on that way the whole time. I never worked with the people themselves. I mean, we didn't have any. A lot of the places and the bases, they had women there that took care of what they called their hooches, their barracks. We didn't have anything like that. We would send our laundry out, and occasionally you got it back, and occasionally you didn't. But we'd send it out, and then a lot of times I would do I'd wash my own stuff. Funny, I slept in a sleeping bag. Well, a sleeping bag, you either slept on top of it or in it, but in that heat and everything, you sweat in one of those things. Well, they reach a point where they stink. They just reek. Well, I had my mother send me over a sheet, and I would put that inside of it, and I'd lay on it and roll up in it, that sheet. But then I'd have to hang it out. I'd launder it and everything else. And the other thing that was interesting was any of our letters that we got, once we read them, we had to burn them. We had to burn everything. We'd have a can out there that we'd burn everything in. I wanted one time, I made a stove out of what they call a number 10 can, which is a big can that holds fruits and vegetables, and took a beer can over and popped it around the top, filled it with sand, and then we'd put avgas in it, in the sand, and then light it, and that became our stove. And I got hold of some popcorn, and we made popcorn. Yeah, but it stunk. Oh man, it stunk so bad from that avgas. And other times we had a game we'd play with these rats. The medics had put out traps because they wanted to test them for rabies and that. Well, we would always get to the traps first, and we'd take them, and then we'd soak these rats with avgas, and then we'd put a big ring of avgas around the outside of that trap, light it on fire, and open up the trap, and then watch the rats hit that ring and go up in smoke. And that was always fine and good until one of them tried to run underneath our tent. And it wasn't pretty. At night, you'd set up a water can. You had a jerry can, what they call it, which was usually a big gas can or something like that, but these are water cans. And you'd set one up in the middle of that, on the floor of that tent. And then you hear the rats bounce off of them at night running through there. It was a game of seeing if you could kill a rat, And that was, I said a long time ago, that was one of the worst things you had was having to deal with them. They're nasty animals. Nasty. The time goes by pretty quickly, and everybody counts their days. You just mark them off, and so many to go, so many to go. We were all young. And like I said, I was probably one of the oldest ones of the young people that were there. I mean, there were officers, of course, that were older, but the Army had depleted itself so much. And then I've stayed out of the politics. I got over there in January of '66, and we couldn't get out. So I filled out my papers, my dream sheet of where I wanted to go. And I put down Fort Carson, Colorado, because I'd like to come back here. Well, that didn't work out too well. And they sent me to Germany. So we were finally able to get out of Vietnam in like the 2nd or 3rd of February. But in that meantime, when you're supposed to get out, and when you do get out, you're on pins and needles. Because that's, you've put up with your year to reach that point to get out. And then you don't know what's going to happen. So you're really watching everything you do. A lot of times you didn't sleep a lot at night. And during the day, whenever you could catch something, a nap or something, you did. And that was the most. But you were really on the awareness that you were keyed to was unbelievable. Because like you said, you never knew when something was going to happen. So I ended up coming back and met somebody, and then, I don't know, several months later I got married. But we lived in Germany for another 18 months. And it was, actually it was a good trip. I enjoyed it. I traveled all over Germany. Ended up, as it happened, there was a lot of people there that had came out of the Cav division. I worked on the flight line there. Well, the guy whose place I took in Vietnam was now my boss. And he got me promoted and everything, so I was now a sergeant E5, and which, as opposed to a specialist, which I was originally. And the difference between the two is a specialist can't command troops, whereas an NCO striper can command troops. Well, they'd had a lot of problems in their unit supply, and they'd had what they called an IG inspection, which is Inspector General comes down from division headquarters, and they inspect it, and you have to try to pass everything. Well, they'd failed it twice. And on the third failure, they get re-inspected again, and on the third failure, if it fails, everybody in that command goes. They're out. Well, they said, would you come down from unit supply, or down to unit supply from the flight line? I says, okay, but provided, if I get it passed, you give me my clearance papers. Once you had your clearance papers, you were pretty much done. You could do what you wanted 6 months early. And just for my own ego, put me in front of the E6 board. And they agreed to it, and I said, okay, I'll come down. Well, we had 13 days to get this done, and I have a letter from the CO there thanking me, because in 13 days I rewrote all the books. We dumped equipment and everything, got it off our TO&E, which is your table of organizational equipment, and so we got a lot of stuff out of there. Rewrote all the books, used different color pens, different writings, and it's hilarious because they gave us a commendation for having the most outstanding unit supply in all of U.S. Army Europe. And everybody that was around there then was just laughing their hind ends off about it, because this was ridiculous. But that's the way the Army worked. So we finished my tour there, and I did. They gave me my papers early. They got me, put me before the E6 board, which had passed, and it never came down because they didn't have what they called a slot to put me in. And I didn't really care about that. But I got back and then ended up, they tried to get me to stay, and they tried to get me to stay in Vietnam, and I said, no. By then my wife was pregnant, and they said, well, if you stay here and re-enlist here in Germany, we'll pay for your baby being born. And I said, you know what, I'll find a way. I don't need this. Because at another point, when I keep going back to some things, but when I was in Germany, it was in the right after, it was in the summer of '67, and as it happened, they came down with a list from the Pentagon. It was 48 men, and most of us were basically Vietnam veterans, and all of us were in helicopters, and they said, you can't leave the post. You can't go anywhere. You've got to remain here. But we didn't know what for. And they said, no, have some gear packed. You don't need any cold weather gear. And I'm thinking, oh God, no. I had that vision. Well, came down and there was 19 of us on the list. And I was still on it. And all of us had, all of us had been through enough in Vietnam, and they were all now Vietnam veterans, and all of us had been through some things. And so, and all of us were single. And we were that way for, well, almost a week then. Yeah, in fact, it was a week. And as it happened, I found out what it was later, is when the 7-Day War broke out between Egypt and Israel, we were supposed to go in and evacuate American personnel that were trapped out there in this. And we were supposed to take a helicopter unit over there and get these people out. But as everybody knows, I mean, the war ended in 7 days, so that was our 7-day war. So that was my experience with that. But I got out and came back to Colorado, and pretty much been here ever since. When I came back, yeah, we were not treated the greatest. We landed in, coming back, we landed in up outside of Oakland. I don't know if that's Travis Air Force Base or where. I think it's somewhere there. But anyway, we landed there, and when we came in, of course, I remember, the biggest thing I remember coming back was coming in, all of a sudden you look down and the amount of lights that were out there. Because you don't know what lights are. When you're in the dark, in the jungles up there in Vietnam, I mean, it's black at night. It's pitch black. And yeah, there's flares popping off all the time and stuff like that, but you just didn't see it. Your eyes weren't that way. Well, you were actually blinded by all the lights from the city. And we landed and we came in, and of course nobody's seen an American girl in a year probably. So, God, just to see one was incredible. And so everybody's staring and everything else. Well, this one long-haired hippie that was with this gal, he turned around and he says, eat your hearts out, guys. I thought they were going to kill the guy. I really did. It was that close. And this is before they ever inspected anything. The stuff they brought back. I had one guy had a huge snake in a bag that he brought back on the plane. And I mean, there was equipment came back on those planes, weapons, everything else, because nobody ever inspected anything. We didn't have TSA. Well, I came back here and Boulder had changed so much from when I was here in '65. And it had changed so much, and it was all hippies. And you just, there was no really recognition for it, you know. You were looked down upon. And I never had to confront anybody. But it was, as a soldier, you didn't get that respect. And it hasn't been until the last few years that they finally recognized what went on. And they're recognizing some of the problems that came out of that war. There's many things could have been different, but again, it goes back to how the country was run at that time. And politics was the big thing. When I got married in '91, we went to Hawaii. And unbeknownst to me, my wife said she would she booked a helicopter tour. And when she told me, I said, you know, I swore I'd never get in another helicopter again. And she, oh, I'm sorry, you know. But I said, we'll do it. I actually got in, and I enjoyed it. I mean, it was fun to be able to sit there, and the guy was a Vietnam pilot. He'd come back from Vietnam, yeah, but he had been a pilot there, and so it was interesting with him, you know. I did go back to Vietnam in 2013, and I did go to Nha Trang, which was really interesting because when I was there, it was dirt roads and real quaintness and everything. Well, now it's a resort town, and Cam Ranh Bay is now a Soviet naval base, and I just found it interesting because my stepson took me over there for my 70th birthday, and it was all these Russians are there, and they're all tattooed and everything else. So there's a lot of gang things going on with the Russians, but all up and down that coast of that there, and even in Da Nang, there are Da Nang especially. There's golf courses and everything else. There's a Greg Norman golf course, and Colin Montgomery golf course, and resorts. The amount of work they've done is incredible. And I didn't notice a lot of, well, in the museums you saw some, the communist influence, because it was biased in the museums. But other than that, the people they were very gracious and no problems at all. It wasn't the cleanest, but you know, it was well done. Everything was being well done. They were cleaning up everything, and they're doing everything they could. But the amount of beaches and resorts that they have now is incredible. We went over on Princess Cruise Lines, and it was through someone that my stepson had met. He commanded the 1st of the 14th Infantry Division in Hawaii. And these guys were part of what they called a Fox Force unit that were out of play coup. And they had their platoon and everything. Well, these guys met and have reunions. Well, they met in Hawaii, and he had them tour. They wanted to tour the 1st of the 14th, and he took them on a tour of it, and then he went out with them, got to know them and everything. As it turns out, the radio operator was Alan Buckaloo. And we called him Buck, and they invited me to one of the reunions too, and I went with him, and we were outside of Columbus, Nebraska for that one. But Alan Buckaloo is the CEO of Princess Cruise Lines. So he put together this tour for anybody that wanted to go, and I don't know how, there weren't that many of us that went, but we flew over to Singapore, and I forget the name of the hotel, but you'll see it in all their posters and everything. It's got twin towers, and it's got an infinity pool that stretches between the towers. It's something. And of course, then for me to see Singapore again after having seen it when I was on R is night and day. Absolute night and day.
It had to be great just getting back, though, wasn't it?
Yeah. I had no problems with going back there. But as far as we never really, every once in a while I'll look to see in the veterans magazines or the American Legion or something like that if they're having a reunion somewhere. And with our unit, it was never, because it was all replacements. You know, once they reached into that September, and some of them were gone before that. I think if they had less than 7 months to go in the service, they didn't send them to Vietnam. But if you had 7 months or over, then yeah, you went. So some of them left after their 7 months or whatever, so, well, basically 6 months over there. They would leave after that. And so I've never kept in contact with any of them since. I think I only have one guy that I talked to, and then we were stationed in Germany together. and I lost track of him. But yeah, I wouldn't even know how to get hold of him. But we never had any reunions or anything like that.
How did you get involved with the museum here?
I got to think about that. Vic Bocart. Vic Bocart and John Atkinson asked me to. Bob Sieber asked me to come and come down and be on the board, because they wanted, at that time, I don't know how many years ago this was. They were trying to get younger people into it, and so I consented to do it, and I've been doing it. I don't know how many years now. It hasn't been probably all that many, but it's well over my term. And basically now I'm off the board. But what I'll do is just to do I do the Memorial Day event, Flag Day, and Veterans Day. And now I'm pretty much trying to find somebody that'll do those. But so far we haven't had much luck. But I'm all set. I've got all next year set already. And I found that for these events, you got to really work ahead anymore. It's just, it's a good place. Hopefully we can get it, we get a bigger place. I've met a lot of really great people that are veterans that work here at the museum. I even met one guy that I met here. Well, he used to work for me back in '78. With any veterans per se, I don't care what war they were in, I've found over the years that they will talk to each other. They find it very hard to talk to other people. And I'm sure you've seen that in your interviews and stuff like that. They will talk to each other, and they'll talk to each other about things that happen. But as far as just getting everybody out there to put on a show, no. It just wouldn't happen. But, I find myself talking. I've made some very unique friends over the years that were veterans. And a lot of them came out of the Vietnam War. But with them, you talk to each other. You handle your problems there. And as far as bringing them, the ones that I've met here, it's an automatic thing. Once they know it and you know it, then it's a whole different ballgame of talking to each other. It isn't like you're trying to carry on a conversation and nobody wants to talk. It's a lot easier, and you have that again, you have that bond that's there that'll never go away. And I think that comes from any type of grouping situation that you have. It's people that were in the same industry talk to each other a different way than somebody who isn't, because they speak a common language and they've lived it. So yeah, that's how I would answer that one. I've had a great life. Mine has been an interesting life. You and I've talked before, and it's some of the things I went through even afterwards, of riots and stuff like that. That's a whole different ballgame, but it has nothing to do with Vietnam. The people that were in Vietnam were not allowed to fight a war, because they could have won, but they weren't allowed to. It was just, I always termed it, everybody's heard the term of cannon fodder, and that's what a lot of these people became, was cannon fodder. Just put them out there, and we'll make a good front of it, but we wouldn't be allowed to do anything. Well, that's why I said I was so happy originally when I said we were so happy not to have those rules when we went over first, because there just weren't there weren't any. So it made things a lot easier. You weren't second guessing. You just made the decision and you went and did whatever you had to do. I was not, as I would call it, I was not a grunt on the ground. I mean, I did my job, and I knew what I was up against and what I had to do, and that was all. You do your job and do the best of your ability, and you're doing what you think is right. I have no reservations about why we were there. I think the leadership of the country at that time was not in the greatest of shape. But as a soldier, you were ordered to go do things, and you did them.